Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Dr. Kaberuka, you're at CHOGM 22, presumably because you want to broaden amongst all the countries here a lot of the initiatives with which you're involved. I just thought we'd go, if you could tell us some of those initiatives and what they're about to begin with, please.
Okay, so first of all, I think it has been an excellent CHOGM. I think the government and people should be commended for organizing such an event of global significance just a few months when the COVID situation has relaxed. So I was here as a special guest of the summit along a few colleagues, but mainly in my capacity as chairman of the board of the Global Fund for AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis, which is based in Geneva, which board I chair. And I was here because many members of the Commonwealth are also members of the Global Fund. And right now, we're in the middle of the 7th replenishment of the fund. So we're looking for about $18 billion to continue looking after people with HIV, AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis around the world, many of whom in the Commonwealth. So the idea was to meet with the leaders of different countries, sensitize them to this, because this exercise is ending in September in New York.
The entire Global Fund exercise?
The replenishment. The President of the United States has agreed to host us, and they have already put $2 billion on the table, and another $4 billion condition on others doing the same. Because overall, we're looking for a 30% increase, because the last time we had $14 billion. Now we're looking for 18 because of COVID has set us back, and then there's inflation in the world. So that has been my principal reason for being here. But also to witness the launching of this vaccine manufacturing capacity in Rwanda, which for me is just a dream waiting to happen, because during the COVID crisis, many of us worked very hard to acquire vaccines for the African continent, and it was tough. So to be there witnessing the launching of this factory was something which really was amazing.
We'll come to that later, because in a way, I suppose those were lessons learned, that you needed to have something like that. It's a very complex thing. I don't expect you to be able to give me all the detail now, but when you're looking at something like the Global Fund, how do you calculate how much you need to ask from various people? You look at what comes in for you to say, well, look, our target needs to be this, that, or the other.
Okay, so before I talk about money, can I talk about the problem?
Okay. Yeah.
So, you remember that, maybe you're still young at the time, but there was a time when HIV/AIDS was a death sentence. It was decimating villages and schools and factories. And when drugs became available in the early 90s, they were available mainly in rich countries. They were unaffordable in low-income countries. They were costing thousands. And so from around 2000, several initiatives were put in place, including the Global Fund, to say, look, let us work together with the private sector, drug manufacturers, northern governments, southern governments, to make these drugs available and affordable. And believe me, the progress made has been incredible. No one now dies of HIV/AIDS unless there's some complications. Mother-to-child transmission is no longer necessary. And truth be told, where we can actually reach out to people living with HIV/AIDS, they can survive. Equally, a lot of progress on tuberculosis, much less. Malaria is still a challenge. So when we go out raising funds, we say, look, we have made progress, but there's still work to be done. And this is why. And so we go from $14 billion to $18 billion because A, COVID has set us back. So in our calculation, we bear that in mind. Second, We need to build resilience for the future. We don't know what future virus will be. And then we look at ability to pay. Because some countries can afford to pay for this kind of drugs. Others can afford less. And so as we do the calculus, we bear all those in mind. Where we're going, disease burden, and ability to pay. And that's what we do.
So now you come in really to look around and help policymakers implement these things. So when you look around these major issues, what are the main things that you find helpful, A, and B, what are the main things that you wish were actually there, that you like there to be, but aren't at the moment amongst the various policymakers with whom you work?
You are referring to the African continent?
Yeah.
Or the Commonwealth?
Yeah, if we look at the African continent mainly, and some of the Commonwealth members share the same issues, but the African continent mainly. And presumably you also link the African continent and the more advanced nations.
I think, for me, there's one thing which is vitally important for the Commonwealth membership to understand, is that a crisis are a new normal. They are not an exception. I can tell you, in my career as a public official, I've seen Ukraine war, COVID, Ebola, global financial crisis. Before that, I think that was 9/11. If you go further back, I've seen the dollar crisis, 2 oil crises. So I think policy making is about A, anticipating the crisis. Number 2, assuring equity in the resolution of the crisis. Because during the COVID crisis, the initial idea was we can share the vaccines available. So a scheme called COVAX, to share vaccines was put in place. It did not work as well as we expected, because wealthier members of the Global North, including some in the Commonwealth, were hoarding the vaccines or having more vaccines than they needed, when the South did not have the vaccines. Some countries in the Commonwealth even banned exports of vaccines. And so the shared values in the Commonwealth, we need to give them meaning, especially when there is a crisis. Because that equity is what gets the family together. But otherwise, the crisis will always be there. And I do believe the key policy needed now is to deal with these issues of inequality, the lack of equity in global response, because the resources are there. Science can always give answers. What is broken is the way we respond to those crises inequitably. And that's why the summit like this is very important, to be able to articulate, look, we're one family, 50 plus nations, but we need to demonstrate that in practice, both in normal times and in crisis times.
Mm. You know these kind of events very well, and not just CHOGMs, but these kind of world events that try to bring people together to resolve these issues. Has this been, we know this has been well organized, that much is clear to anybody who's been at it, but has it been in any way different, given that it comes immediately after a pandemic, so people's minds are more concentrated than they normally would be? Has it been in any way different? Are people more exercise a greater sense of urgency when you compare it to all the other similar kind of events that you see?
I think it would be naive to think that perhaps, say, European countries at this summit are not preoccupied with what is going on in their backyard. I could see that at the summit, Euro-African summit in Brussels. These countries seeing war in their backyard for the first time since 75 years. Real war. And worried about energy security, where they get gas and oil, especially before winter comes. Worried about defense spending, right, against their giant neighbor. worried about what it will cost to reconstruct Ukraine. So all these things must be in their mind. But I suppose one has to say to them, this is a major crisis. It's a global crisis of enormous proportions. But there are other crises in the world. The crisis in the Sahel has not gone away. All right? The climate crisis has not gone away. So we have a series of interlocking crises, which makes for a perfect storm. And that requires that you can't say, I will resolve my problems first, and then I'll see what I can do for you. No. Whether it is security, whether it is pandemics, whether it's food security, whether it is climate, we need to figure out a new form of multilateral response where all of us are on the table. And this is the importance of a summit like this one, because it enables us to speak to each other quite frankly.
Mm. So my next question really dovetails into that. COVID-19 as a virus, as a disease, was unexpected. But a pandemic was. People knew a pandemic was coming. The point that you make about, in a way, really, yes, humanity is about crises. The farther back we go. So there was, I remember, for instance, one of the arguments in America was that the previous incumbent had left preparation for the pandemic, and they weren't followed and so on. Presumably they went around the world. So were these preparations pointless? Were they not looking where they should have been looking? And have we learned something that, we keep being told that the next pandemic is not a question of if, but it's a question of when. We don't know the nature of it, but they say it's a question of when. So have we learned something that will help us do better than we did with COVID-19?
Vincent just published a very good book.
I saw that. Yeah.
Which says quite a lot, and he knows a lot about pandemics. There is a saying that, I don't know if you heard about this one. Epidemics have been with us since the early days of mankind. And even worse, we had a plague in Europe, which decimated almost 40% of the population. So we shall live with viruses and other forms of bacteria and protozoans for a long time. But so epidemics will always happen. But when an epidemic becomes a pandemic, it's not about the virus. It's about our response to the virus. So it is a failure of governance, either at national level, regional level, or global level. That's what makes for an epidemic to become a pandemic. So this one became a pandemic because of failure of global governance. As I mentioned, lack of sharing vaccines, sharing equipment, sharing, testing kits and so on, banning exports. But there's even worse. When the pandemic begins to taper off, people are now talking about we're in the post-COVID era. I'm not sure about that. It is post-COVID in the north, in rich countries. But in the global south, where only less than 10% of the people are vaccinated, it's now going to become from a pandemic to become an endemic problem. So an epidemic becomes a pandemic, it's a governance issue. But when a pandemic becomes an endemic, i.e. a disease like any other in large swaths of the population, there is issue of inequality and inequities. That's what it is. This is why today at this summit we had a session called Malaria and Neglected Tropical Diseases. Okay? Disease of the poor. I said to them, no. Actually, I understand the meaning, but I don't accept the concept of neglected tropical diseases. Because you can't neglect a disease. You neglect people. So I said maybe we should call it, all right, the diseases of neglected people. That is what it is. So there is little research going to tuberculosis or drugs, new drugs. Little research into malaria, thanks. There's a vaccine on the way. HIV/AIDS now does not kill film stars and wealthy people in California. It's a disease essentially of poor people, largely in the global south. So it is becoming endemic in the global south. It has become an endemic problem. It was a pandemic at some point. Now it has become an endemic problem. I fear that COVID will probably be the same. Will follow the same beaten path.
You again lead me into my next question, which is you mentioned governance, and it is a crucial, it's an essential role in solving any of these issues. Now you're Rwandan, so I don't want to invite you to be in any way partisan. But when we look at how Rwanda responded to COVID-19, it was really, objectively looking at it, so much better than a lot of the other African countries who've got bigger resources, both in terms of material resources and human resources. So when you look at, again, bearing in mind of the next pandemic, any lessons within the African continent? Because if Rwanda can, why couldn't they?
Oh, you could even go further. Yeah. You could even go further. COVID exposed, even rich countries, failure of the state, let alone in Africa. So we're able to distinguish states which are fully functional and they can deliver for their people, all right? And states with varying degrees of dysfunctionalities, which even with a huge amount of resources, were unable to respond to a virus. Okay. So I think Rwanda here was an example. But I should, by the way, add that it is now generally accepted that Africa has done much better than even wealthier countries. Okay? Both in terms of how it was able to deploy its little capabilities at very high economic costs, because the lockdowns, the disruption of economic activity has come at high price. But we saved human lives. Okay, that was the price to pay. And to this one, I must say that for the first time, Africa and African institutions did much better than others. For example, there is this institution now that's called Africa Center for Disease Control. I've heard it being said by many people that it did much better than its European counterpart or its Asian counterpart. And overall, even the response of the African Union was much, much better than anything I've seen before. So I think at a moment of peril like this one, states which are functional, which deliver for their people like Rwanda, were able to respond. Others were not able to respond. Still are not able to vaccine even 5% of the population. So it exposes that weaknesses in rich countries, in poor countries, but on balance, Africa did much better this time than many other parts of the world. And of course, within Africa, there were variations. There were countries which did exceptionally well. Rwanda is one of them. Some other countries like Mauritius, Seychelles, I've said like Ghana as well, Senegal, some in the north, like Morocco. But others did far less well than they could have done.
Mm-hmm. So, all right, then let's go to resources again with the idea of preparation. Now, we keep hearing a lot that, look, it's not a question of lack of resources, it's how they're deployed and how they're accessed. I just wonder if I can add on a question that says it is not just how they're deployed and how they're accessed, but it's also the governance to where the resources are going and where who asks for them. So what are the things that we need to be able to, say as a policymaker, you'd say to them, look, in order to get hold of these resources and use them properly, you need to look at X, Y, Z. Where are they? How does one get hold of them? Because on one hand, we're told there is no lack of them, but on the other, people are constantly complaining about the lack of them.
So now, no. First of all, let me correct maybe something I should should do. No, resources will always be limited. This is why the profession of economist exists, because resources are scarce. You have to make choices. You cannot do A, you have to do B, and so on. The art of economic policy or public policy is about a continuum of 4 things. It's about resources. This one, you need a lot of it. It's about policies, right? If you have resources and bad policies, resources will be wasted, right? It's about capacity to execute. If policies are very good, but you can't execute them, there's wasted opportunity. And this is about governance, okay? Executing for whom? Serving with equity, with justice, with fairness. Okay, so once you could have these 4 things in one space, i.e., it's about policies which are technically sound, that is not very difficult, but they must be executable, okay? But before they're executable, they must be politically implementable. And that's the space of governance, choices, and where issues like equity, fairness, social justice all come in. You could have tons of resources. Libya had tons of resources.
Yes.
I live next to Libya. They've done some things well, like housing, but for example, in public health, they're doing far less well. You're talking about 2 million barrels of oil per day. There are many African countries who are in that range. 1.5 million barrels of oil per day, 2 million, but where the level of poverty is still 60% of the population. So it can't be about resources only. It has to be about policies. They must be sound. It must be about executing capacity. And it's about governance. So those 4 is what we call the sweet spots of how you get things done.
Now, you have an understanding of African economies as much as anywhere and better than most. And so when you think about those things and take the temperature of how they stand, how do you think we've already established they've done quite well during the pandemic. How have they managed to establish the foundations for recovery? And do they have, not institutions necessarily, but general ideas that will guide? Again, I'm looking towards the next possible crisis and so on that have been learned from here. So how are they doing now? And have we got lessons where it's not going to be remedial action the next time?
It's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag. You're talking about 55 countries. Not the same. You're talking about the fact that about 3/4 of all Africans live in about 8 countries, the big countries. So what happens in those big countries is very critical, very critical. And some of them, there are things to be fixed. However, on balance, I want to believe the following, that up to 1973, the first oil crisis, I don't know how old you are or if you're born, but oil went from about $3 per barrel to $12 in 1 year, 4 times. And then a few years later down the road, almost 6 times. That was the first time Africa saw a huge shock on its body economic. So like you had 4 parts of the world like this. You had the Middle East, which was just swallowing surpluses, huge dollar surpluses. You had countries in the global north, like now, worrying about energy security, where to get oil, because there was an embargo on exporting oil. Okay? Maybe like now, but not similar. Countries in Latin America, many of them were just had debt explosion. In Africa here, we began a long period of what we can call, economists call it stagflation, stagnation and inflation. And that thing went on for a long time. That's why you have something called a lost decade. Actually, a lost decade and a half. beginning 1980 up to late 90s. But from around 2000, actually many economies began to recover. It's for the first time the majority of African countries, not all, began to see a positive real per capita income, i.e. economic growth, exceeding both inflation and population growth. There was even a funny phrase called Africa Rising. I never used the phrase myself because I'm a bit skeptical, okay? But even during the global financial crisis, where most people thought Africa would be the continent most affected, we were bruised, but we recovered, right? So in that, continue with the continent growing about 6.5%, which was not bad. We had issues of job creation, of inequality, lack of transformation, that I agree, all right? But there was growth nonetheless. My fear now, i.e. the combination of COVID, high oil prices, and disruptions in the supply chains or different things, that you could see another prolonged period of stagnation. And the only way to respond to this is, frankly, by African countries beginning to act together. And to figure out in the global supply chains where we belong. And I'll give an example, that would be my only one. So people like you, newsmen, you are writing about the coming hunger, famine, because of the logistics of getting wheat out of Ukraine and Russia. Did you know that we've got 14 African countries who produce wheat? From Zimbabwe, Zambia, Kenya, Sudan, Ethiopia, I could go on. Okay? And together they produce about 24, 25 million metric tons of wheat.
That's probably a little bit more than Ukraine, I think.
No.
Or about the same.
What we import is about 52 million metric tons. But what is interesting, when I look at the data, I was listening to the Zambian trade minister yesterday. I found that yields of wheat in Zambia were actually the same as Ukraine. And double that of Russia. So it means actually, within a span of a few years, these countries, now that they have got a huge market out there, they could ramp up their wheat production, all right, and take the market which is left by Ukraine and Russia. Period. It's not a rocket science, it can be done. A country like Zambia has huge amount of land. As I said, they can grow wheat, same levels of productivity if they get fertilizer, that is. So I think we need to configure our thinking in terms of these supply chains are disrupted. What do we do? Do we need to set up industrial parks to begin to manufacture some of the things for which we've been relying on foreign lands? It's no longer about where is the cheapest place I can buy something. It is where is the most secure, reliable place I can get vaccine, medicine, or food. That's why this idea of making vaccines in Africa is excellent. And I hope we can make many more things.
You raise an important point about where Africa stands in the supply chain. Just quickly, a little bit more on the war in Ukraine. I think it came as an enormous surprise to most people. The rise in energy is understandable. That will affect everybody globally. The market is the same. But that, for most Africans, would have thought should be it. But then they're all worrying about things like cooking oil and worrying about wheat. An entire continent is derailed by a war that is going on 4 plus 5,000 miles away. That shows a major weakness at really where these supply chains you speak about. And one wonders whether or not people have taken that on board and thinking of the sort of things that you've just mentioned.
First of all, let's not underestimate this conflict in Eastern Europe, because it affects all of us through multiple channels. I think supply chains for food is one, high energy prices is another, but there's also issue of the dollar and the payment systems, which is quite important. So all those three interact together in some ways, depending upon where you are. So it's a hugely important problem. Now, in the short term, obviously, we'll have to adjust to higher oil prices. And countries will have to act differently depending upon whether you're an energy exporter or energy importer, whether you subsidize oil or you don't. So countries will have to adjust. When it comes to these food products, I am persuaded. I am totally persuaded that now that we have a continental free trade area, we have the capacity to produce rice and wheat, edible oils, all that stuff. Not in 6 months, but now that opportunities are there. Okay? Remember, you can find evidence today of a country is able to quadruple the yields of agricultural production in 5 years. It's quite possible. It's doable, especially for things you have mentioned. So I think the continental free trade area now gives us an opportunity to re-examine what are things we can produce and exchange in Africa. Now, that requires a lot of things to happen. Yes. A lot of things to happen. It requires to look at tariffs that have been dealt with largely, non-tariff restrictions, movement of people, payment systems. So if we do that, we create a capacity to absorb shocks from outside, whether they are currency shocks, whether they are energy shocks, or pandemics, or security like the ones in Ukraine. So I think my guess is it has been a wake-up call, but I think we're better off responding together. I really don't think that the word famine, which I've seen newsmen use, is the right word to use. Because the famine is normally a political crisis. Yeah. Yeah. Famine is never a physical shortage of food. There are studies from Bengal in the 40s, from Ethiopia in the 80s, from many other places. Famine is a function of politics and ability to purchase food, right? Not a lack of availability of food. So, during the crisis in the Horn in Somalia, people were dying. Why? Because many of them keep animals, camels and other animals. And because of drought, their source of income, which was animal products, had disappeared. So even if you put food there in the shop, they can't buy it. They don't have the money. All right? So famine is not what we're discussing here. We're discussing disruptions in the supply chains, which are manageable in my view, in the short term. In the medium term, if we respond by producing our own food, I think it can be done.
Okay, so very quickly, let's move on to the FCTA since you've mentioned it. You also mentioned the time, I think it was 90s, when they were talking about Africa Rising. And
2005.
Right. So I remember at the time, one of the factors they were mentioning, that is got all of these resources and people are being interested in all of that. I kept wondering, well, you know, they are raw resources. But anyway, that was Africa Rising. And if there was an opportunity, it seemed to have been somewhat missed. I wonder, the FCTA could be a revolutionary thing. And I'm just wondering, when you look at it, whether or not that opportunity also might not be missed, because in order to take advantage of it, as you pointed out, a number of things need to happen. People need to be prepared for it. Or are we going to get foreign direct investors coming in, taking advantage of it, but really the supposed owners of it not doing very much with it?
First of all, be fair to yourselves. You know, integration has 5 levels. The lowest is what we call the PTA, preferential trade area. You reduce tariffs among members, but you don't eliminate them. The next one is what we call the FTA, a free trade area. You totally eliminate tariffs among members, right? But you keep them against non-members. Okay? Common customs. The next one is a customs union. The next one is economic union, monetary union, so on. Now, different regions of Africa actually are far advanced this stage than the FTA. East Africa community here. We have one common external tariff. We have many institutions in common. Countries in SADC, in ECOWAS. Some countries in ECOWAS have one currency. So our different parts of the continent have reached actually some of them higher levels than the FTA. What that is taken now is to harmonize all that into one FTA. Now, if you look at it carefully, it's no longer about tariffs. The weighted average tariffs in Africa is about 13.5%. Non-tariff restrictions are coming down slowly, not fast enough. Infrastructure has improved reasonably well. We still have challenges. But there are things where we're already going much slower than you could be doing. One, movement of people. If every country in the FTA did what Rwanda does, which is you can come, we'll give you visa on arrival, that would be hugely important start. Second, payment systems. We need to trade with each other using our currencies, not looking for dollars. All right? That's being worked upon. We need to establish digital trading systems. It's being done. And how about the single aviation market? So that where the infrastructure is limited, roads, rails, people can fly in and out. So those things are being worked upon now. As you know, economic integration is never easy. Ask the Europeans. There are always frictions, zero-sum calculuses, which delay things. But I think, on balance, I'm much more optimistic this time.
Best practice. Where do we need to look at for best practice, not just within Africa, but worldwide when we are looking again the next crisis, the next pandemic, and of course, global warming? Where are we looking at where most countries can learn from and do really what those people are doing to the best of their ability?
No, I think there's something you need to reverse your thinking. Crisis management is art of economics. But planning for the future is something you should keep your eyes on all the time, crisis or no crisis. So there are three things in Africa which will not change, whether there's a crisis or not. The first is the demographics. I told people the other day in a room that there are more people in Nigeria than Russia. They couldn't believe me.
I remember I was there.
Now, you are there.
Yeah.
Now, the average age in Nigeria is 25. Average age in Russia is 55. And I could say that. And that demographic pyramid is growing. It won't go away. South Asia and Africa. And so what does this mean? It means whether there is a crisis or not, whether it's come from the financial markets, from the viruses, we need to plan to build on these demographics for the future. You need to plan education, that's for them. Second, the climate change you're mentioning. But I would say climate change and energy transition.
Yeah.
Because remember, there is an industrial revolution every 150 years. Oh yeah. The first one, led by the British, which lasted 150 years, was based on coal.
Internal combustion engine.
The next one, led by the Americans, was led by oil. All right? Okay. Now, watch carefully what is happening in China. It began by industrializing on the basis of coal and oil. Now China has become a leader in renewable energies, green energies. Are we seeing the start of a new revolution? I think so. And whoever will gather that, whether it's in its infrastructure, its agriculture, its river systems, that's where the issues are. So I combine the demographics, the climate change, and energy transition together. Whether you have a crisis or not, you have to keep your eye on them. Now, in the short term for climate change, for us Africans, the challenge is where to get money for adaptation. Where to get resources for adaptation. Again, I'll go back to issue of inequality. Guys in the north now focusing on energy security, they're completely off the radar on the issue of adaptation. So we need to figure out a way of finding own resources for that. But I think, unlike you are, instead of thinking of preparing for the next crisis, I would definitely do so. But I'll keep my eye on things happening in the longer term trends of the economy. My demographics, what's happening in potential for future jobs in the digital space, all right? And energy transition. That's where I think the FTA is very important. These are not things small countries can do alone. We have to do it together.
Last couple of questions. Essentially, yes, you talked about resources. Now let's look at Africa independently and resources. Again, there are cliche statements now. Africa is rich, but Africans are poor. But there are resources here. How do you galvanize your own resources before you go to look at resources elsewhere?
No, it's a challenge. But please distinguish, as one famous American professor puts it, there are two kinds of resources. The resources you inherit, like minerals, oil, gas. You have done nothing to produce them. You just need capital and investment to get them out. Okay. Then the resources and wealth which you create through innovation, through education. I think that is the most important resource for me at the moment. And this is why I keep talking about the demographics. So the place to begin is actually figuring out how to invest in that resources, the human beings, this young generation. Because if they have enough capabilities, all those problems, they resolve them. Where to get capital, how to build roads, how to innovate. But if they have already invested in the education, that's what they should be. So for me, I'll start by investing in education. That's how I mobilize my domestic resources. But I think you're referring to savings. Are we doing enough to mobilize continental savings? The answer is no. The answer is no. If you combine Africa's savings at the moment, and here I'm defining them broadly, institutional investors, insurance companies, pension funds, because we are a young continent, or reserves of central banks over and above what you need for the rainy day. If you combine them, invest them together, instead of investing in New York for 2.5% return, that is massive. But has it happened? No. Is that a wise thing to do? Yes.
All right. So again, you've got really. You mentioned the word optimism a little earlier, and if for most people with the kind of experience that you've had and a lot of things that you're helping to work out, a lot of things that you're steering, it would be understandable and it's easy to put one's head in one's hands between one's knees and just say, this is impossible. People don't seem to be listening. We've got all of these things looming, but where's the sense of urgency? So when you look at all of these things together, what would you give the impression you get about where our world is, where it's heading, and the sort of things that you suggest that can get us to where we can be as optimistic as you insist on being?
First of all, I don't think I'm an optimistic. I think let me put it this way. I was still, where was I? I was at college when there was a phenomenon called Vietnamese boat people. People were fleeing Vietnam in massive numbers to Australia and New Zealand. Like the Mediterranean people is people from the Horn and from the Middle East. Same. I was actually at secondary school when China was in the middle of a cultural revolution. 20 years before that, they had a famine, which is believed to have killed about 24 million people. China. All right? If someone had told me in 1972 that China would be the second largest economy today, soon to be the first, I would not have believed it. But something happened in between. What happened? First of all, China is big, right? It's not here 20 million people, 10 million people. China is almost several countries in one. Look at India, the sixth largest economy in the world. Sixth largest economy in the world. But India is a large federation, right? So I would say, focusing in Africa here, and looking at what is going on in the world, all right? Lack of multiple action, lack of global cooperation. I would focus on figuring out how to succeed in the continent of free trade era, number one. Second, I would look at how to address issues of peace and security. We have far too many pockets, where you have a combination of stunted development, an ecological crisis, climate change, and then peace and security is in the Sahel, the entire Sahelian belt, right? Broad Sahelian, or the Horn. Those things are a huge setback because they combine, right? So I would figure out how to address that. And that requires that you come to it from many angles, okay? I worked on a project called the African Union Peace Facility to try and help countries when they have challenges, be able to deploy their own capabilities. But that is the number two issue. So peace and security. So integration, peace and security. Number three, the digital economy. The young people I say we are training, we should invest in, will be operating in a digital economy. And you absolutely have to get there with them, okay? Now, the other small problems we have at the moment are manageable, okay? But those three, integration, peace and security, and the digital economy, is where I would put my focus, bearing in mind where the world is going as you have put it. Because the world in the north will be getting older, all right? Oh, the number of Russians is declining, okay? Like most of Europe, all right? So that means the demographic force in the south. Okay. Long time ago, people used to say peace and security is an African problem. Now look at what's happening in the middle of Europe. So it is a problem everywhere, okay? Now, the digital economy is because of what I've said about this industrial revolution every 150 years. So we're already at the beginning of this next one. And we need to make sure African young people just enter it as soon as they can, because that is the future. That's where jobs will be. Whether it's jobs in the services industry, it will be in the digital space.
Dr. Kaberuka, you allowed us until sunset. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Very, very grateful.
Much pleasure.